Hello, everyone. Good evening. I take the right of the chair to speak a few words at first. Williamson's first lecture attracted more than 4,000 people to listen. The lecture just in English, no Chinese translation. So many people attend, make me happy. Before these lectures, I sent the whole program to all the members of IIP, that is International Institute of Philosophy. Some members replied me very positively. Great, wonderful, a great initiative. A major philosophical event. Well done. Something like that. So, Professor Angel Pascal, the Secretary in General of IIP, promised to put the whole program onto the website of IIP. I think Sunday or after also do something spreading. So I got some email from United States, from France, from Sweden, from Mexico. Some scholars asked me to get the access to Williamson's lecture, or want to get the recording of his lectures. So the whole events have been got international attention. So we do our best. Let this event to be significant philosophical events, not just in China, also internationally. So we do our best. Then is Tim, your turn. Okay.
Right. Thank you. So today I'm going to be talking about philosophy and disagreement. And I want to start with two contrasting stereotypes of the philosopher, two images of philosophy and the people who do it that you might associate with the word philosopher. So the first of them is the one that you often see in cartoons of a philosopher, is the guru sitting by himself, because it normally is a he on that stereotype, by himself on top of a mountain, speaking words of wisdom. And then the contrasting stereotype with that is two philosophers disputing without end, interminably with each other, arguing away and maybe disagreeing in some lively, possibly even violent way. So the first kind of philosophy is naturally expressed from a literary point of view in the form of enigmatic aphorisms, sayings of the philosopher that are short and somewhat mysterious, a bit like the sayings of an oracle. And in ancient Greece, the paradigm of that kind of philosophy might be someone like Heraclitus. At least what is preserved of him is just consists of these kind of aphorisms, which are just said, and then you have to make of them what you can. Whereas the second kind of philosophy is naturally expressed in the form of a dialogue with two or more voices. And of course, the ancient Greek example of that is Socrates, or who was famous just for doing philosophy by talking with other people, not by writing at all. Although, of course, what we have of him is Socrates as written down by Plato, which probably doesn't fully correspond to the original Socrates. And if we think of contemporary analytic philosophers, their style is much closer to the second stereotype than to the first, to the philosophers arguing with each other rather than speaking words of wisdom. Maybe some contemporary non-analytic philosophers are a little bit further on the spectrum towards the guru end. Now, just to comment on the contrast, I mean, very obviously on the second model, the model with philosophers disputing with each other, philosophy, it's explicitly a social activity, something that people do with each other, not just by themselves. But even on the first model, philosophy is implicitly social, because it's part of that stereotype that the guru has followers who climb the mountain to listen to his words of wisdom. And as I said, the stereotypical guru is male, so that they can then spread them around and gain new followers for him. I mean, there's not much point in the guru just speaking wise words on top of the mountain if no one is listening. So in a way, they both illustrate the social aspect of philosophy, but in different ways. And I think this is quite a significant aspect of philosophy, that as a social activity, philosophy takes place in a medium of communication, which is normally a language, normally a natural language, occasionally a formal artificial language. And of course, occasionally we do use other media of communication than language, using diagrams, maybe gestures. There are even cases of philosophers who try to convey their ideas by dancing. But those are all forms of communication. And of course, the dominant one in most philosophical traditions is language. Whereas thinking thoughts privately in one's own head is not yet a contribution to philosophy. So, as it were, it's a false idea that somehow the thinking of the deep thoughts itself is a philosophical activity. It's crucial to philosophy that it has this social aspect, which is also, of course, what enables there to be philosophical traditions in which ideas are passed down from one generation to another. And of course, we shouldn't pretend that this is something that's exclusive to philosophy. I mean, the same thing applies to science and indeed to any intellectual discipline. That these all have a social aspect, and in all these cases, of course, we couldn't have a tradition without some form of communication. And in all cases, the contribution to the discipline consists in what one contributes to this communication. It does not consist in itself in the just the thinking of deep thoughts or something like that. Now, I want to reflect a little bit more on the differences between the two kinds of social activity in the two models of philosophy, the two stereotypes. So, if we think about the guru-follower model, it's social, but it's socially asymmetric. The followers, they defer to the guru. They put themselves in a pupil-teacher relation to him, or as it might be her, whereas the guru does not defer to the followers. So there's an asymmetry in their relationship. Whereas in the model, the stereotype of philosophy as represented by two philosophers disputing with each other, that's a socially symmetric model. The disputants are not deferring to each other. They're disputing as more or less equal partners. Of course, it may not be perfectly symmetric. And if you think of the case of Socrates, he liked to be the one asking the questions. And so there was a little bit of asymmetry between him and his interlocutors because he was asking the questions and they were answering them. But it was still much closer to a socially symmetric relationship than the guru-follower model. Even though, of course, famously Socrates came from a lower class family, and so in that sense, in terms of the social hierarchy, there was an asymmetry between him and the people that he was talking to, but much less so in their dialogues. So, one can think about the advantages and disadvantages of these two models. And the guru-follower model seems to fit the early stages of the teacher-pupil relationship. Pupils who dispute everything their teacher says, they may never learn anything. If they come thinking that they already understand things better than their teacher, then they're not likely to learn from their teacher. But that model doesn't work so well for later stages of the pupil-teacher relationship. But as the pupils learn more, they may realize errors in what their teacher says, and the good teacher will listen to their objections and responds to them on their merits. That's to say, will not automatically correct the student, because it may be that the student is right and that the teacher is wrong. And the bad teacher is the one who overrules the pupil's objections and does not respond to them on their merits, just as when treats it as automatic that the teacher is right and the pupil is wrong. And I think it's clear that both sides learn much more from the first kind of exchange than from the second. And I say both sides because I think in a productive relationship between a teacher and at least a relatively advanced pupil, the teacher is learning from the pupil as well as the other way round. And certainly that's one of my pleasures in teaching at Oxford, that I've got a lot of good students and I can learn something from them, as well as I hope being able to teach them something. And I think it's relevant to recall something about the discussion of evidence in lecture 1, which is relevant here. So one moral I was drawing there is that all our sources of evidence are fallible. So that, they're capable of producing something which it may be presented as evidence, but in fact is false, or at least it's not known whether it's true or false, and so it doesn't constitute evidence. And so because all our sources of evidence are fallible, we must be ready to recognize that something we had treated as known and therefore as evidence is false or doubtful. And so in either case, not known and not evidence. And so since people can be sources of evidence through testimony, no teacher is an infallible source of evidence. And I think it's important that that the pupils, after a certain stage, particularly once they're adults or close to being adults, that they realize that their teacher is fallible. And I think one aspect of this is that, as an English historian once said, all power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That someone who's treated as a guru, treated in effect as infallible, an infallible source of evidence, is thereby granted power over their pupils, and that power can corrupt. And I think one aspect of this, as well, the more intellectual aspect, is that if one's treated as infallible, one's much more likely to stop worrying about the danger of error and being much more careless about what one says. And I mean, so in other words, you're much more likely to make mistakes if you know that what you say will not be challenged. And that's one of the respects in which teachers benefit from pupils who are ready to dispute with them. I mean, when I'm teaching a class with good graduate students in Oxford or elsewhere, I mean, I know that if I say something wrong, they're very likely to pick it up and point out the mistake, and that's good for me. And of course, pupils benefit from teachers who are ready to be disputed with, and by challenging their teacher, and maybe by finding out that the pupil is right, or by finding out that the teacher is right, which can be either, the pupils learn much more from the exchange. And of course, another way in which the two disputants model of philosophy is needed is that there's more than one teacher and even more than one guru in the world, and so we need some kind of model for what happens when they encounter each other, and that is the two disputants model, that we don't all stand in some kind of linear hierarchy where anyone you talk to is either stands in a teacher-pupil relationship to you or to a pupil-teacher relationship to you, where in many cases where even as well from an institutional point of view, we're talking to each other on a footing of equality. This social aspect of philosophy, although it's in fact very visible in contemporary philosophy, but in the way that philosophical problems are formulated, the social aspect has been somewhat marginalized, and so one can see this, for example, in the way that that paradoxes are studied. So if you look at the way paradoxes are formulated and presented in contemporary philosophy, what you tend to get is logicians putting them in the form of logical arguments, typically from common sense premises or premises that seem obviously true, which then seem to, by logically valid steps, lead to contradictions or absurdities. And classic examples of these are the liar paradox, the person, roughly speaking, saying that what I'm now saying is not true, or the paradoxes of vagueness, the Socrates paradox, where if you have a heap and you take one grain away, you still have a heap, but if you repeat that process 10,000 times, then you may be left with 1 grain or 0 or whatever, and yet you've got a premise which seems to be telling you that if you had a heap before you took the grain away, then you still have a heap after you took the grain away. But those are simply put in terms of abstract arguments in contemporary philosophy. But those paradoxes originated, as far as we know, in ancient Greece. And the Greeks put those paradoxes typically in the form of questions and answer dialogues, little dialogues like, if you have 10,000 grains, does that make a heap? And then the answer is supposed to say yes. And then if you take 1 grain away, do you still have a heap? And they say yes. And they get into trouble with paradoxes of vagueness in that way through a dialogue rather than through a logically formulated argument with premises and conclusion. And so in ancient Greece, the social aspect of these paradoxes was much more overt than it is in contemporary philosophy. But I think when we consider the use of logical arguments in philosophy, you see that there is a social aspect to it, and that aspect actually is quite significant for the way that we do things with arguments. So even supposing you're using a logical argument to convince someone of a conclusion, then you're going to need to choose the premises as ones which the hearer will accept, because if they don't accept the premises, then obviously they won't have to accept the conclusion. And so there's an implicitly social aspect there in the choice of premises, and that also forces the person who's constructing the argument, it motivates them to imagine how things look from the other person's perspective, so that they can see what kind of argument will seem weighty from the other person's point of view, what kind of argument will have premises which they will accept, and I think this is particularly important in relation to issues about the what are called fallacies of argumentation. There's a kind of standard list of such fallacies, which goes back to the ancient Greece, but and people often assume that these fallacies are something which is studied in formal logic, but in fact, they're actually quite difficult to relate in many cases to formal logic, because they implicitly depend on the social aspect of argumentation, which of course is something that in formal logic we usually, not always, but usually completely abstract from. So here's an example that there's a fallacy of what's called begging the question, where you accuse somebody of begging the question, and that's supposed to be a really bad thing about the argument that they're offering. The paradigm of begging the question is where the conclusion is actually identical with the premise, so it's an argument of the form P, therefore P. But of course, in practice, you very rarely get something that is as crude as that. Normally, in some way, the premise, it looks different from the conclusion, but it's actually much closer to the conclusion than is appropriate, or something like that. And so people have tried to define the fallacy of begging the question in this more general sense, where it doesn't require that the premise and the conclusion actually be identical. They've tried to define it in purely logical terms, but what typically happens with such attempts is that they imply that all logically valid arguments beg the question, which of course is a disaster, because it means that the accusation of begging the question, it can't be a fallacy in any objectionable sense if it's a property that all logically valid arguments possess. And I mean, I'm not going to go into the details here, but I think it's pretty clear that to understand what's wrong with this committing this so-called fallacy of begging the question, one has to consider what's needed to persuade someone who does not already accept the conclusion, to persuade them to accept the conclusion. And so it's really difficult to make sense of this fallacy of begging the question without getting quite serious about the social aspect of argumentation, the fact that it's an attempt to persuade someone of something. Of course, sometimes one devises arguments just to convince oneself of something, but even there, there's a kind of social aspect. I mean, that you're, as it were, talking to yourself, and I think without understanding even that kind of social aspect, it's difficult to make sense of what's going on with the problem of begging the question. So I want now to start thinking about the issue of the relation between the social aspect of philosophy and agreement and disagreement. So, of course, social cooperation often requires agreement on what to do, and since I've been talking about persuasion and so on, it's one natural hypothesis is that argumentation aims at agreement. Now, sometimes it's not important what we agree on, which alternative we take, as long as we do agree with each other. And the classic example of that is the case of conventions. And I mean, more generally, this has to do with the coordination of behavior. So the simple example is it doesn't matter whether everyone drives on the right or everyone drives on the left. That it's arbitrary, but the important thing is that everyone drives on the same side of the road. And so as we're there, agreement is the primary thing that you're aiming at. But in most cases, agreement is not a matter of pure convention. So to take a kind of intermediate case, suppose that we have a group of friends who are deciding which restaurant they're going to go to together to have dinner. So it does matter whether everyone goes to the same restaurant, but that's not the only thing that matters. It also matters whether we all go to a nice restaurant or we all go to a nasty, horrible restaurant. And so there's something that's required beyond simple coordination with each other. And in science and philosophy, there's not much merit in everyone agreeing on a theory if the theory is in fact worse, e.g., it's further from the truth than the alternatives. And I mean, the fact that agreement produces harmony in the community of scientists or philosophers is much less important than whether they're agreeing on something that's correct or something that's incorrect. And I think that too much emphasis is laid on agreement in discussing these matters. So if agreement were our only aim, we might be able to achieve it by agreeing to that we'd gather no more evidence and we do no more thinking about the issues. We just stay where we are with the evidence that we already have and the thoughts that we've already got. Suppose that we've all managed to attain some kind of agreement, then we might feel, let's not endanger this agreement by doing any more thinking or gathering any more evidence. And in fact, in some circumstances, the desire for agreement can lead us to ignore or suppress inconvenient evidence or inconvenient doubts about what we take to be evidence or inconvenient thoughts. And there we have the danger of too much emphasis being put on conformity and not enough on what we're conforming to. By the way, I should mention here as well that disagreement is not always such a terrible matter. Even in cases where we know that the disagreement can't be resolved. So, for example, if you take the disagreement between people who follow the theory of evolution, of natural selection, versus, let's say, religiously motivated fundamentalists who accept some creationist story, I think it's safe to say that neither side there will ever convince the other that they're wrong, but that doesn't mean that there is no knowledge in that case. I mean, in fact, it is the evolutionary biologists, I take it, who know the truth in that case, even though there are people that they can't convince. So, agreement. I mean, the lack of agreement doesn't have to be a sign that there's no knowledge there. So I think the thing to go back to, which also came up in the first lecture, is that science and philosophy are driven by curiosity, the appetite for knowledge, not just belief. Now, of course, if everyone knows the answer to a question, they're all going to agree on that answer because all knowledge is true. But what matters is not the agreement, the shared belief, but the shared knowledge. It's because it's knowledge that's shared rather than belief. That's a crucial thing. And so agreement, I mean, it can be a manifestation of the fact that everybody knows the truth, but it can also be a manifestation of, let's say, some pressure to conformity of a kind which may actually be opposed to the acquisition of knowledge. And so, given that premature agreement is often an obstacle to knowledge, I think a disposition to argumentation, to disputation, that's often a way to prevent premature agreement, and in the long run, to make it more likely that we'll reach knowledge. But there's an aspect of this that some people are very uneasy about, because arguing is typically a competitive activity. I mean, we do speak of somebody winning or losing an argument. And there's also, at least in analytic philosophy, there's terminology for a draw. It's called a standoff. When people sometimes say it's a standoff, where they're kind of offering a draw to their opponent, that saying, all right, let's agree that neither of us has won or lost this. But we might think, well, surely philosophy and science and social activities should be cooperative and not competitive. Now, I think that's a very superficial argument, because it's treating the distinction between the competitive and cooperative as if it were just all at one level. So, a simple example of this, if you think of the game of chess, of course it's competitive. There's winning and losing. But if you have a chess club, that's a cooperative enterprise. That's people cooperating together so that they can play chess. In fact, even a single game of chess is in fact typically a cooperative activity, in the sense that the two players are cooperating so that they can both play this game. And the hypothesis that I'm interested in is that philosophical disputes are competitive, but that philosophy through disputes, a philosophy which, as it were, employs disputation as a central feature, is nevertheless a cooperative enterprise. In fact, the contrast between chess and an intellectual activity, of course, is not so extreme as you might think, because the role of knowledge in chess is kind of obvious, and by playing a game, both sides are gaining knowledge of chess. And in fact, if you were to formalize chess, you would realize that the chess knowledge, where it's knowledge of whether a given position is a winning side for the white or black. That's fundamentally a kind of applied mathematics. It's not particularly numerical, but in a more abstract sense of mathematics, it's actually just a branch of mathematics. So now, if we're going to think of argumentation as part of this overarching cooperative enterprise aimed at knowledge, we need to think about how competitive disputes serve the search for knowledge, because each side is aiming at winning. They're not aiming at finding the truth in the particular argument. Of course, this depends a bit on the psychology of the people who are arguing, but I think it's very obvious that in many arguments in philosophy, and of course not only in philosophy, and all sorts of other areas too, the arguers are focused mainly on the issue of winning the argument. And of course, some people find this very distressing, stressful, and maybe unworthy, and that philosophers should not be like that. But the fact is that often they are. So I think one thing to emphasize about this is that it is not an exclusive feature of philosophy. For example, natural science has has a similar competitive aspect, though it's not played out so much in terms of just verbal argumentation, although, of course, that does happen in quite a lot in science. But maybe a more striking manifestation of it is where you have research teams racing against each other to be the first to a discovery. You might think of the current research aimed at finding a vaccine for COVID-19. And that, I think it's a pretty safe bet that there is a seriously competitive aspect to the psychology of the people involved in that. But that isn't necessarily such a bad thing, because the competitive aspect of science increases motivation, and that may drive discovery. And where human beings motives are very rarely pure, but if we can in some way harness the impure motivations to a good cause, such as finding a vaccine, then that's a much more realistic way of dealing with the impure motivation than by some completely unrealistic ideal of just eliminating all impure motives from science. And of course, as is famous, I mean, there are extreme cases where competitiveness in science leads to cheating and fraud. I mean, cases have come out where people have been falsifying the results of their experiments in one way or another. But I think that realistically, the way to handle that is not by trying to eliminate all impure motives from the science, but by having a good system of controls, which are good at detecting cheating and fraud, so that they're unlikely to be rewarded. And once we've got a good system of controls, then in general, competitiveness serves the search for truth, in the sense that the best competitive strategy is just to do the science as well as you can. And I'm going to suggest that something of the same kind applies to philosophy too. So in the case of philosophy, given how much of the competitive aspect of it takes the form of argumentation, what we need is a good system of controls to prevent cheating in argument. And given such a system, competitiveness serves the search for truth. So, for example, we don't want it to be the case that the person with the loudest voice wins, and we don't want it to be the case that the person who can speak most quickly wins. But naturally, the kinds of cheating that are much more dangerous in philosophy are not ones that are as crude and obvious as those, but subtler ones. And so we need controls on those. We need controls on cheating by, in some way, presenting arguments which seem to be logically valid, but in fact are not, for example, and of course, very often the person who's presenting them doesn't realize that they're not. So, I think one partial analogy, which is worth thinking about, is with adversarial systems in the law. So many legal systems use such an adversarial system to structure court cases. So there's a lawyer or a team of lawyers, a legal team for each side. In a criminal case, one side is the prosecution and one side is the defense. Now, the lawyer's role is to make the strongest possible case for their side, not to do their best to find the truth. I mean, lawyers, for example, they're not supposed to point out ways in which the evidence actually goes against their side, but that's the job for the other side to point out. So one role of the judge in a court case that has that structure is to be there as an umpire or referee to prevent cheating. And then the verdict is decided by what's supposed to be an impartial jury or judge, or in cases where there's no jury, it's typically several judges. So the system as a whole is aimed at finding the truth in these cases. That's what its job is to do. But the idea is that the best way of doing that is on the basis of competition between the strongest arguments on each side. So that, as it were, if you have each side with lawyers who are motivated to find the strongest arguments for that side, then that's the best way of eliciting the full case on each side. And I think that's a model for dispute that we could consider for disputation in philosophy, and it's worth thinking about the similarities and differences. And of course, it makes it very obvious that this is a fallible model. It's clear that sometimes the wrong side can win in a court case. And this is not pretending otherwise for the case of philosophy. So, I mean, one difference between these two cases is that lawyers typically argue on whichever side is paying them or that they've been assigned to, irrespective of their personal opinions. So their motives might be, well, more honorable one is duty to their client, but we can assume that they're also concerned with things like their reputation, their career, their money, and so on. Whereas philosophers are typically invested in the truth of their case, and they rarely change their mind, which is a manifestation partly of that. Although, of course, being realistic, philosophers are also to some extent motivated by considerations of reputation and career and money, which is consequent on those, because philosophers are human. What we don't have a very close equivalent of in philosophy is the jury or the judges. But to some extent, the community of professional philosophers plays a similar role in, as it were, deciding who won that argument and who didn't. So there's a bit of that going on, but it's certainly much less, as it were, institutionalized than in the case of the law. Now, one aspect of this is that philosophers are typically rather unwilling to change their entrenched theoretical attitudes. I mean, there are some philosophers who are kind of famous for how often they change their mind. So one example of that is Bertrand Russell. Another is more recently Hilary Putnam. I mean, these are people who put forward very different views at different points in their life. But that's unusual, and that's why it's so remarked on in their cases. It's what you tend to find are philosophers who stick with very similar views over the course of their professional careers. And certainly in my own case, I'm not somebody who's changed my mind a great deal over the last 30 years. Now, of course, one can be very worried about the fact that philosophers are so unwilling to change their minds, and in a way, they seem to be very close-minded in a way that one might feel is inappropriate for a philosopher. But in a different respect, those kind of attitudes actually strengthen the adversarial system. They help the community to explore thoroughly the resources, the intellectual resources of their favored theories to meet explanatory and other challenges, so that theories are not abandoned prematurely. So that, as it were, there's actually some value in having people who are kind of obstinate and very, very reluctant ever to admit that they're wrong. And in this respect, philosophy is not so different from natural science. So in his famous book from the early 1960s, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Thomas Kuhn, in effect, explains how irrationally strong theoretical commitments at the level of individual scientists can combine into a rational enterprise at the level of the scientific community. So, on his picture, you have the older scientists who are backing the old theory, who are very, very unwilling to give it up, even when the evidence is against them. And you may have, but younger scientists who may be somewhat very, very reluctant to give up the new idea, even though it seems to be facing all sorts of very difficult challenges. And on Kuhn's view, it's really important to have, as it were, both the obstinate old scientists and the obstinate new ones, because most scientific theories face serious anomalies, which may often take many, many years, more than a person's lifetime, perhaps, to resolve. And so we need some mechanism for people investing in theories, even when things are looking rather black for the theory, so that those theories are not abandoned when there is, in fact, or there may be some way that they can explain the anomaly. But as well, we need scientists who are willing to stick to the theory long enough to find, and are strongly motivated enough to find those answers. So there's a comment which is attributed to the physicist Max Planck, which is that progress in science is measured by funerals. I mean, I'm not sure whether he actually said that, but he certainly made comments to the same effect. And his idea was that what happens when there's a scientific revolution and an old theory is abandoned and a new theory takes its place is that the old obsolete theories, they're not abandoned by their defenders. The defenders typically hold on to the theory and refuse to admit that it's wrong. What happens is just that the defenders of the old theory die, and new defenders of the old theory are not recruited. The new people entering the profession all go for the the new theory. So, as roughly speaking, students deciding where they're going to do their PhDs, they don't want to work on a degenerating research program in the sense of the philosopher of science Imre Lakatos, because their career is going to go very badly if they're committed to such a research program. And at the point where they're deciding where to do their PhDs, they're fairly open-minded, certainly much more open-minded than the older professors about which are promising research programs and which are not. So that it's the students entering the discipline without strong prior theoretical commitments who are acting as something a bit like a jury in an adversarial system. They're voting with their feet. So that although the old professors may be still defending some old theory, the students who are just deciding where to do their PhD, and they're not going to study with them because they can see that they're losers. Now, and so I think, given that mechanism is quite prevalent in science, I don't think we should be surprised that it can play a role in philosophy too. And since it doesn't prevent the natural sciences from being a very effective means of gaining knowledge, it should not be such a devastating problem for philosophy either. What I want to talk a bit about now is another aspect of, if you like, of the refereeing or umpiring of philosophical disputes, which has to do with the kind of rules that these disputes are carried out under, and the search for truth. Because it can sometimes seem that what we're dealing with is just some sort of intellectual game, and then as we're following the stereotype, people think, well, if it's a game, then it's not involved in the search for truth. And I want to bring out ways in which that's a false contrast. And so we could start by mentioning it, in medieval times, in Europe, these scholastic philosophers, they debated philosophical questions by playing a competitive game, which was called in Latin obligationis. Sorry, that's I think the spelling checker has changed the Latin into the English word. It should be obligationis, I think. Which involved one side constructing arguments and the other sort of challenging their premises, and the game. This was a game with formal rules. Very, very formal rules about the structure of premises, and you had to say which premise you were going to challenge, and maybe how you were challenging it, and so on. And there was an umpire for these games who would be a more senior philosopher who would make sure that people were sticking to the rules. And although it was a game, these rules corresponded to laws of logic. And of course, the point of a law of logic is that it guarantees that if all the premises of an argument, which conforms to the rules, are true, then the conclusion is also true. And so the kind of logic games that scholastic philosophers played they were genuinely games. They were competitive games, but they also played a role in the search for truth. And this is something that you can also find in modern logic. So, I mean, the idea for this, it actually goes back to some things that Charles Sanders Peirce said, in fact, when he was talking about vagueness. But the person who's one of the people associated with the formalization of this is Jaakko Hintikka, the Finnish philosopher and logician. And he developed something similar called game theoretic semantics. And so this is a game which is played with respect to statements in a formal language, although I'm not going to formalize things here, because the essential points that I'm going to be making don't depend on that. And in the game, at each point, there's one player defending a statement and another attacking it. And at each point in the game, there's just one statement which is in play, which is being attacked and defended. But as the game progresses, the statement that is in play is, it's replaced by simpler and simpler statements according to the structure of these statements, until we finally get down to an atomic statement, a statement which can't be analyzed into component statements. And if the atomic statement is true, then its defender wins. But if the atomic statement is false, then the attacker wins. And there's a very elegant connection between the rules of the game and classical logic. And it's all set up in such a way that a statement is true if and only if its defender has a winning strategy. And it's false if and only if its attacker has a winning strategy. And because of the nature of the game, one or other will have, either the defender or the attacker will have a winning strategy. So that there's this correlation between the truth value of the statement and the question of which player has a winning strategy. And of course, it's this connection with truth which helps to make this a semantics. And in effect, what we've got with those equivalencies is a statement of truth and falsity conditions for the statements of the formal language that it's actually being played in terms of who has a winning strategy in the associated game. And since this is all a bit abstract, I thought it would be worth just going through some of the rules so that you can see how this works, to give a sense of how argumentation can actually be molded to the search for truth, given appropriate rules. So the first example I want to take is where the statement in play is a universal generalization. And I've given the example of everything changes just because it's a very simple universal generalization. And of course, it's also one of philosophical interest. I think I mentioned Heraclitus right at the beginning of the lecture, and this is a kind of statement of Heraclitean view. But the choice of change is just incidental. The structural thing here is that we're dealing with a universal generalization. So what the rules say is that if the statement in play is such a universal generalization, let's say everything changes, the rules require the attacker to select an object O. This object might, if you want, you can imagine that we have a domain of objects in the background, and all the universal generalizations are being understood as generalizations about this particular domain. But that's that aspect that's not important for these purposes. What's important is that the attacker just selects an object, and the game continues with the statement O changes in play. So as it were, now you move to a new statement, and then the rules take over for that again. Although, in this case, it would depend. If the statement O changes is an atomic statement, then we've actually got down to ground level. I mean, you could also have some logical analysis of what it is to change, which would then allow you to make a whole lot more moves in this game. But we don't need to worry about that. We're just concerned with this one move. Now, the crucial thing is that if everything changes is false, it has a falsifying instance, a counterexample, which the attacker can select as O, so that O changes is false. And so, as we're roughly speaking, this will preserve the attacker's winning strategy if they have one. Because, I mean, supposing let's say that we took. I mean, O might be a particular cloud or something, and then we would be moving from saying everything changes to debating whether this cloud changes, and perhaps we could even observe it changing. Sorry, but of course, then that would not then be a counterexample. But so the kind of thing that the attacker needs to do is to select something that would be a counterexample. So maybe they might select the number 7 or something, so that the debate would be about whether the number 7 changes. Whereas, of course, if everything changes is true, then it doesn't really matter which object the attacker selects, because the instance will also be true, and then that will just preserve the winning strategy which the defender has. So in a way, because it's a universal generalization, it's easy for it to be false, because any counterexample makes it false, and that corresponds to the fact that it's the attacker who gets to choose the object with respect to which the play continues, or with respect to a statement about that object. And a second example is where we have existential rather than universal quantification. So let's say that the statement in play is something changes. So the rules require now the defender to select an object O, and the game continues with the statement O changes in play. And that's because with an existential generalization, you only need one instance, positive instance, to make it true. So if it's true, then it has a verifying instance. Let's say the changing cloud in this case, and the defender can select that verifying instance as O, and that means that the simpler statement O changes, which is now the statement in play, is true, and so that would preserve the defender's winning strategy. But if something changes is false, that would mean that nothing, in fact, nothing changes. Change is an illusion, which of course some philosophers have thought. It doesn't matter which object the defender chooses, because whichever one they choose, O changes will be false. And so that will be preserving the attacker's winning strategy. So, I mean, we could go through all sorts of logical constants here. I mean, in fact, if you look at conjunctions, things of the form A and B, then they work very similarly to the universal generalizations. And if you look at disjunctions, things of the form A or B, they work like the existential generalizations, and the rules are similar too. But just for a bit of a contrast, it's interesting to think about what happens when we have a negation. So let's suppose that the statement in play is, it's not cold outside. Sorry, there should be a quotation mark at the end of outside there. Then what happens is something a bit different from before. The attacker and the defender, they exchange roles, and the game continues with the statement, it's cold outside in play. But the person who was the defender for it's not cold outside becomes the attacker for it's cold outside, and the person who was the attacker for it's not cold outside becomes the defender for it's cold outside. So they switch roles, and what that corresponds to is the fact that if it's not cold outside is true, then it's cold outside is false, and vice versa, and similarly in the other direction. And if it's not cold outside is false, then it's cold outside is true. So the way in which negation switches the truth value of the statement corresponds to the switch in roles between the defender and the attacker. So again, this is a device which means that whoever had a winning strategy before continues to have a winning strategy when we look at the simpler statement, the one that was without the negation. So strictly, if you take the game theoretic semantics completely seriously, then it uses the existence of a winning strategy to define truth and falsity. Well, falsity, that's the absence of winning strategy. Now, I don't think we should take this too seriously, but because it's really quite an idealized approach. So the player with a winning strategy may be unable to recognize the winning strategy because they're in no position to identify the verifying or falsifying instance, or they may not be in a position to check what the truth value of an atomic statement is. So, for example, suppose that the statement in play was there is a spy, then the defender of that statement would be they'd be required to choose an object O and defend the claim that O is a spy, where O would be like a name for the spy. But of course, if they don't know who the spy is, then they're not in a position to choose the right object. And in fact, I'm in that position now. I mean, I think I know that there are spies in the world, but I don't think I know the name of any spy. So I would not be able to provide an instance. And so this winning strategy that one player or the other has in principle, it may not be possible to implement it because they don't have the required knowledge of the world. They can't identify which move is in accord with the winning strategy, even if in fact they do have a winning strategy. They may not be able to recognize it. And I certainly don't think that this is a good way actually to define the nature of truth and falsity. I think that all this stuff about the game is a kind of distraction from that. But I do think that the game theoretic semantics provides a kind of toy model of how the rules of a competitive game can be designed to make winning align with truth and losing with falsity. And it may be that in quite a few cases we have enough knowledge that we can apply a winning strategy in these cases. I mean, for example, I think when philosophers are choosing counterexamples, what they're doing is that they're looking for cases where it's pretty clear that this is a counterexample, and often, if you're dealing with a false statement, a false universal generalization, if you look, I mean, you don't know of each object whether it's a counterexample or not, but there may be some objects which are very clearly counterexamples, and so you can choose the right object for the game to continue with, and so I think that although it's a very, very simple kind of model, it does show how the choice of rules, in fact, can be designed so that the game is in some way has this tendency to lead you to the truth. I mean, of course, one question that one would need to consider is how we generalize those rules to languages with a much larger expressive power, natural languages, and I think for many kinds of construction that we have in natural languages, something much more complex is required. I mean, for example, if you're dealing with statements of the form "most x's are y's," that's not something that one object can be a verifying or falsifying instance for. I mean, it's not one object which can make a most statement true or false, and so you'll need something much more complicated. And and I think in practice, quite a lot of philosophical discussion takes place in circumstances where nothing like those rules is available for some of the key terms which are being used in the dispute. But nevertheless, I think it's a kind of model which reminds us that even in a case where the rules themselves seem highly artificial, and you might think if you just saw those rules without any explanation and without any mention of truth and falsity, it might not be obvious that they had any connection with truth or falsity. You really have to think about how the truth conditions of the relevant sentences to work to realize that these rules, in fact, are correlated in quite a deep way with the truth and falsity of the statements that are in play. So, I think, as it were, a kind of idealized picture of a well-functioning philosophical community would be one where the rules of philosophical disputation work in something like the rules of the game in game theoretic semantics. And what we would also require in such a community is that the members of it are that they're good at detecting when one of the players is cheating. So, in the example of the rules of Hinteke's game, which I was talking about, it's in most cases it's pretty easy to detect whether somebody is conforming to the rules or not, because they are very formal. But even in the case of that game, though, there are ways in which it's not as easy as you might think to determine whether cheating is going on. But under such conditions, disputation is it's an approximate guide to truth. Let me just mention a couple of ways in which even the Hinteke style games are subject to kinds of cheating that are not so easy to detect. So one thing is that when the attacker or the defender has to choose an object and then the game continues with a statement about that object, what they have to do is to, in effect, provide a name that's presumably a name that people already understand of the object, or possibly point to it or something like that. But one problem can be that it may be unclear whether the name that they provide refers to anything or not. And in fact, I've already given an example which illustrates that, because I was talking about the case of what you might do if you were attacking the statement that everything changes. And so your job would be to name an object which does not change. And I suggested there that you might say then that name the number 7, and then the game would continue with respect to the statement that the number 7 changes, because actually that seems like numbers are not the kind of thing that do change. But there's a kind of cheating which could be going on, which is that I've assumed in giving that example that that the words the number 7 do name a particular object, and that's quite a controversial position in philosophy of mathematics. I mean, Platonists tend to think that that 7 is a name of a number, but there are plenty of philosophers of mathematics who deny that that's the way that numerals like 7 work. So there, it's simply controversial whether an object has been picked out, and so that's one way in which the rules are not as cut and dried as you might hope. And then the other way in which they're not so cut and dried is when it comes down to an atomic statement, one with no further structure to be unpacked, because then the community has to decide who's won if we're thinking of it as a game, and who's won depends on the truth or falsity of the atomic statement that's been chosen. So, for example, if the atomic statement was the number 7, so even if the community grants that the number 7 is a genuine object which can be named, there might also be disagreement about whether the number 7 changes. I mean, it seems implausible that it changes, but you could have a view on which the number 7 changes over time. For example, if you thought of the number 7 as picking out some kind of, let's say, the collection of 7-membered collections, then if objects were going in or out of existence, then the number of 7-membered collections would also be changing. So I mean, you could have that view. So, so that in deciding who's won the argument and who's lost, the community would have to decide on the truth value of an atomic statement, and that, as I say, might also be a controversial matter. So, you know, it's not that the rules of the Hintica game eliminate all room for reasonable controversy about whether a move is legitimate or about who's won and who's lost. They don't completely eliminate it, but nevertheless, those rules are a step towards disciplining the dispute in a way which is truth oriented. And you know, I think that in fact, if you taped, you know, a bunch of reasonably well trained philosophers arguing, you would find that at various points they were doing something that was quite similar to Hintica's rules. That they're and in particular, I think you'd see that that they were in their treatment of counterexamples and then positive examples to prove the existence of, to prove the truth of an existential statement, that they were in effect obeying the rules of Hintica's game. And you actually, I mean, you sometimes hear people insisting on that. You can hear people sometimes saying things like, "It's my example, so I can develop it the way I want," and they're insisting on the fact that as it were, that it's their choice of move at that point in the game, and so they are the ones who decide which object it is that they're picking out, or some analog of that. So, you know, so I think that although one would have to idealize away from a lot of important aspects to think of Hintica's kind of style of logic games as a way of resolving or policing philosophical disputes, they do show the underlying rationality of quite a bit of what is going on, and they show how the as it were, the game structure is not the kind of enemy of truth in the way that you might take it to be. Okay, so that's what I have to say for the time being about philosophy and disagreement. So, in looking forward to the lecture 3 on Monday, one thing that came out with the discussion of logic games is that philosophers are having to deal with rules of language, or you might think of thought, associated with various logically significant expressions in our language, and that kind of prompts the thought. Well, you know, maybe one of philosophers' main jobs is somehow to be the people who police the rules of our language, or maybe also people who construct better rules for our language. And to put it in the terms that I've taken the title of lecture 3 from, I mean, they might think that it's their job to be clarifying the rules of the language. And in lecture 3, I'm going to be examining such a conception of philosophy. I mean, in the end, I don't think it's a correct conception, but you can see various kinds of attraction it has for some philosophers. So I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Williamson. Yes, I gave a very short introduction to the interlocutor or questioner. And the questioner, Dr. Zhang Yiwen, receives his PhD from Leipzig University. Now is a postdoctorate research fellow at Peking University. His research interests focus on non-factual contents and their applications in epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of science. Dr. Hu Xinmin is an associate professor of philosophy at Nanjing University and specializes in epistemology. So, yes, your tutor. Yes. Okay.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Professor Chen-bo, for the introduction and for organizing this wonderful event. And thank you to Professor Williamson as well. I'm honored and thankful and thrilled to have this opportunity to deliver a response to Professor Tim Williamson, one of the best philosophers of our time. In his talk today, Williamson presents a view regarding how dialogues, and especially disputes, could be crucial for us to philosophize. And this idea resonates with me deeply. In order to respond to him, I think the best way is also to raise some issues that I think are disputable and to compete against him in hopes that this could eventually achieve some cooperative results in doing philosophy. Okay. So to begin with, Williamson distinguishes between two different models of interpersonal communication. Generally speaking, there's an asymmetrical kind of model for learning, and there's a symmetric kind. In the asymmetrical model, the interlocutors rather stand in a teacher versus student relation. So their conversation would be more like an educational process, a process where I may defer to an expert regarding an issue, since that expert is assumed to have the evidence that I don't have. But we also have the symmetric model, where two parties can be peer disputants, and they can be rather competitive or adversarial. And they may have competing hypotheses and disagree on what actually the case. For instance, suppose one side believes P while the other side believes not P. Ideally, they could eventually resolve the disagreement by gathering evidence and find out, say, P is actually the case. And if so, now P becomes their common knowledge. Also, besides, Williamson has drawn multiple analogies between disputes and games. So like what's done in game theoretic semantics, the winning and losing conditions of a game can be defined in alignment with the content's truth and falsity. So the idea is that a dispute can be seen as a zero-sum game, leading to the growth of the group's common knowledge. And precisely in this sense, we can say that a disagreement as well, although competitive, but in an equally important sense, it's also cooperative, since it leads to the growth of our knowledge. In fact, as Williamson argues, and I agree, in such case, what really matters is whether the belief presented by one side is actually knowledge. So as long as we now know the answer, it's only of secondary importance who used to believe otherwise. In other words, as long as we now have the answer, we know it, it doesn't really matter who was wrong, who was right, etc. So if I understand it correctly, this is Williamson's central idea on how we should understand disputes in general and philosophical disputes in particular. Well, however, here's a competing hypothesis of mine. Perhaps that's not the only kind of disagreement that we might have. We could still have a more disputative or truly adversarial kind of disagreement, which does not directly add to knowledge. And if so, we might have a certain kind of philosophical disputes that are not so cooperative, at least not so cooperative in Williamson's sense. Okay, Next slide. So as Williamson also puts it in his slides as a hypothesis, philosophical disputes are competitive, but philosophy through disputes is a cooperative enterprise. And as mentioned for Williamson, the primary aim of intellectual cooperation is to gain more knowledge, right? But my concern is precisely that this adversarial aspect of philosophical argumentation might be in conflict with the aspect of incremental knowledge. So if a philosophical dispute adds to knowledge, then it's not genuinely adversarial. If a philosophical dispute is genuinely adversarial, then we don't have a clear sense in which it adds to knowledge. Well, by the way, Williamson also mentioned in his talk that, for example, evolutionary theorists may be disagreeing with creationists, but there could be still some sense that they gain a knowledge through their disagreement. But perhaps that's exactly something I'm not sure about. So I'm not sure whether an evolutionary biologist would agree that that she will believe that her dispute with a creationist could indeed lead to some gain of more scientific knowledge. So, and also, if we consider philosophical inquiries more specifically, when Williamson claims that we can gain knowledge through philosophical argumentations, it would also be interesting to know what kind of philosophical knowledge does Williamson specifically have in mind. Would it be general wisdoms or insights or certain sort of interpretations or something else through philosophical inquiry? Okay, so back to my suspicion. My suspicion is that we do have this latter kind of genuinely adversarial dispute that doesn't directly involve the learning of evidence or any increment of knowledge, but it's nevertheless part of our practice of philosophical inquiry. In fact, I think when Williamson himself sometimes mentions the adversarial features of philosophical disputes, what he was really talking about should belong to this latter adversarial kind. So that's basically my big picture question on Williamson's account of philosophical argument. So in the remaining time, I'd like just to explain what I mean by the truly adversarial disputes. My basic idea is that truly adversarial dispute must be somehow disruptive. But let's take a look at a non-disruptive kind first. So when you and I have conflicting beliefs, such as P versus non-P, then of course we disagree. But this is not a disruptive kind of disagreement because we're just disagreeing whether a content P is correct answer or not to a given theoretical question Q. Here I'd like to call it an intra-theoretical disagreement. But when I talk about theories and meta-theories, what I have in mind is not like certain specific scientific theories, but rather like Kuhn's paradigm or Kitcher's argument patterns, Lakatos, or even Carnap's linguistic framework. So when is the disagreement intra-theoretical? We can have an example here. In a game of chess, we may wonder whether, say, queen to e5 is a winning move for black. And a verdict on this question indeed adds to our knowledge, since it is a piece of factual information. But if we have disagreement regarding this question, then at the end of the day, one of us must have had a mistaken argument. Suppose that your argument is right, that moving the queen to e5 is a winning move, then I'll be simply put into checkmate and lose the game, right? I can see that there's a sense in which philosophical arguments do behave in this way, such that we are engaged in a kind of intellectual karate, and you give me a knockdown argument so powerful that eventually it must be rational not to accept your argument. However, I'm not sure how far this analogy might go. In a chess example, even if I lose the game, I will still your opponent by definition. And I might even return your favor by showing you a winning move next time when we play the game. But the worry is that in a genuine adversarial argumentation, generally speaking, neither side should ever be knocked down like that. Because, and this is my hypothesis, because in a truly adversarial dispute, it is typically the case that neither side really possesses the ruling evidence that supports themselves to count as having the right answer to the right question. And if so, then no one will be evidentially the winner. Oh, by the way, there might be the case that, well, neither of us had evidence, but at a later time, we somehow managed to discover the evidence, and we somehow find out that the evidence rules in my favor, for example. But that's just the case that I happen to be the winner as a matter of luck. So I wouldn't take this to be a genuine case of adversarial argumentation. But if in an adversarial argumentation, no one really has to answer, what could they be disputing about? Well, one possibility is that their dispute is not really substantial, so that they might be only having a verbal dispute. But I think there's another possibility. They could instead be engaged in a kind of extra-theoretical or meta-theoretical dispute in which participants could be, let's say, disagreeing over whether question Q is a proper question to ask for pursuing a certain generic discursive goal. Of course, then the question would be, can we really have rational arguments regarding this disruptive kind of disagreement? Is this kind of disruptive disagreement resolvable? I have to admit that I don't have a definitive answer to such question. But perhaps we can take a hint from Williamson here. In his talk today, he has shown us that there are actually many general rules that we are expected to follow, even for doing philosophy. So perhaps even in an adversarial argumentation, we do have some general expectations, at least, about what would not be a good philosophical question. In other words, although an adversarial argumentation might not be really informative or productive, nevertheless, it might be help us to discard some unfit questions while focusing on new and hopefully better questions instead. And anyway, regardless whether any argument could be really resolved in this way, I'm sure that at least it creates more space for us to not only be charitable, cooperative interlocutors, but in the meantime, be obstinate adversaries of each other in a disagreement. So thank you.
Wu Xinmin, it's your turn. Wait, open your. You don't open. We can't hear.
Sorry about that. Yeah. Okay. So I don't have any slides. I will just ask two questions. First, I'm not sure whether I understand Professor Williamson correctly. Professor Williamson, you seem to think debates between philosophers are somehow like debates between lawyers. The judge or jury decides which side wins. In philosophy, as well in science, people who do not take sides before hearing the debate act like a judge or a jury. Now, suppose I have a debate with Yiwen on the nature of knowledge, and I argue that knowledge cannot be analyzed, but Yiwen disagrees. Now, it seems that Professor Williamson thinks only the audience who do not take sides before hearing the debate are qualified to judge who wins the debate. To be sure, the audience, in order to be competent as a jury, must have some intellectual virtues, such as being skilled at reasoning. But Professor Williamson seemed to think that if the audience already takes sides before hearing the debate between me and Yiwen, then they are not impartial and therefore cannot serve on the jury. Accordingly, I think if that's Professor Williamson's view, then he is not qualified to judge who wins, because before hearing the debate, he is already committed to the view that knowledge cannot be analyzed. Right? Or So here I might misunderstand Professor Williamson's view. So do you think that you may still be qualified to serve as a judge before you can, because you can temporarily suspend your judgment about the issue under the debate? I think this question is practically important because often we write a paper criticizing a certain philosopher's view. Journals often send our papers to the philosopher that we criticize. That's my first question. My second question is about Professor Williamson's view that in a well-functioning philosophical community, disputation is an approximate guide to truth. I think this question is connected to Ewan's comment. Philosophers have debated on many issues for hundreds or even thousands of years, but still disagree with each other. This persistent disagreement seems to me, and also seems to other philosophers such as William Lycan and Peter Van Inwagen, that no philosophers know any philosophical truth, perhaps except some possibilities. If that's so, then disputation is not a reliable way to discover truth. So my question for Professor Williamson is, do you think that's because philosophical community has not been well functioning? If all philosophers are intellectually virtuous and well informed, would they accept the verdict of the ideal judge and acquire philosophical truth? Or do you think that even two fully intellectually virtuous and well-informed judges may end up disagreeing with each other on which philosopher wins the debate? If so, how can a disputation be a reliable guide to truth in a well-functioning philosophical community? That's my two questions. Thank you.
Right. Well, thank you very much for both of you for those interesting challenges. So I'll try to cover the points you raised. You both raised quite a number of points. So beginning with Yi Wen's comments, he was suggesting a kind of contrast between two kinds of dispute: the adversarial and the non-adversarial ones, or at least the disruptive or non-disruptive ones. Where on the non-adversarial side, he was thinking that one side or the other could simply produce a knockdown argument. And everything would be resolved, and then we'd gain knowledge. But then suggesting that philosophical disagreement is often not like that. So rather than two kinds of dispute, I would suggest that what we've got is a sort of continuum where, with at one end, the two parties agree on almost everything. They have exactly the same theoretical framework and so on, and then there's just one small point where they disagree. And at the other end, where they have radically different approaches and theoretical frameworks and so on. And I think clearly there are all sorts of intermediate positions as well. One thing I'd say about the question of why we don't get a resolution of the dispute that both sides accept in many cases, he suggested that that's because, in fact, neither side possesses decisive evidence. I think, in fact, it may often be that that one side or the other does possess decisive evidence, but the other side refuses to grant that it is decisive. So I think in quite a lot of our fairly common sense, ordinary knowledge is decisive on quite a lot of matters. So, for example, I take it that we know that many people know which country they live in, for example. I mean, that seems like the kind of knowledge that most people have. But if we know that many people know which country they live in, then it's part of, on the view of evidence that I'm defending, it's actually part of their evidence. The fact that many people know which country they live in is part of their evidence because it's something that they know, and that's decisive evidence against skepticism, in the sense that it entails that various kinds of philosophical skepticism are false. But of course, it's not in practice going to settle the dispute, because the skeptic will refuse to allow that they have such evidence. And so I think often the pattern is that one side or the other actually possesses decisive evidence, but the other side refuses to allow it as evidence. But still, of course, the effect is that in practice the dispute doesn't get resolved. So when it comes to the way in which philosophical disputes lead to knowledge, I'm thinking that apart from the as it were, the ones which are relatively easy to resolve because they just depend on some detail within an agreed framework, that the way in which they, as would lead directly to knowledge, is only to relatively local bits of knowledge. So I think that that, for example, when you have a dispute with someone, you learn something about, as it were, what we might call the game space, about what moves can be made, and you also learn something about their position, and so, for example, an evolutionary biologist who debates with a creationist, they might get some knowledge about what creationists believe. I mean, obviously, that's a very different thing from getting knowledge about evolutionary biology. And it's likely that when an evolutionary biologist debates with a creationist, they don't get any new knowledge about evolutionary biology from that. I mean, they might, but it doesn't seem very likely. So of the kind of larger scale knowledge, I think part of what I'm suggesting is that the knowledge comes about less directly through people observing the overall pattern of these, perhaps of many different particular debates and so on, so that it may be through that observation that that you realize that one side is bankrupt, and I mean, and you may see that because you see them just making kind of very unexplanatory moves, or so for example, on the problem of evil, which is used as an argument against theism. If I see that the theist starts having to invoke evil caused by devils or something like that, that tells me that they're kind of running out of plausible defenses. And so you start to realize what's a degenerating research program and what isn't, which is not something that one learns directly from one specific series of argumentative moves, but from the overall pattern and from the way in which one side is forced to make more and more desperate ad hoc hypotheses. And then I think you mentioned on this, maybe on the side of the more adversarial disruptive disputes, ones between people who have different frameworks, and so they might be disputing about whether such and such is a good question. And so I think often those are cases where what one learns is it indirect. I mean, in fact, I think the most plausible way of settling disputes about whether such and such is a good question is just to let people ask the question and see where they get. If the question leads on to some kind of fruitful inquiry, then that seems to show that it's a good question. Of course, it won't settle the issue completely decisively, because the hardliners on the other side may insist that what looks like a fruitful inquiry is actually worthless. I mean, I remember having an argument once with someone who thought that after Aristotle, natural science had started asking the wrong questions, and that the whole of natural science post Aristotle was a series of wrong questions. But so the people can always hold on to some extreme, but I do think in such cases it's actually many people observing the overall pattern can come to know something about which side is right, even though doesn't have to be the immediate outcome of one particular exchange. And then just going on to Xingming's questions. So yes, I do think that it's very difficult for philosophers to be impartial in assessing disputes, and I think often that's it's not simply because of philosophers having some kind of psychological bias. It's also because the question about what's appropriate evidence and what's a good explanation and so on, that those questions are bound up both with the first order rights and wrongs and with the sort of second order questions about who's winning the argument. So you can't really separate the two. And I think you raised a good question about how in practice this works out with referees for journals reviewing papers. And I think it's common experience that it does make a difference whether the reviewer is sort of basically sympathetic to the side that the article is on. But I think that often what happens is that the reviewer, and as it were, treats it, the article as addressing a kind of narrower question rather than a big question about, let's say, whether externalism or internalism in epistemology is correct. They treat it as, has this article shown that a particular argument on one side is wrong, or that something like that. And as it were, by taking the question at issue to be something very specific, where the reviewer can give a judgment which either way without undermining their fundamental tenets. But it's a very tricky issue, and I think just suspending judgment about the issues it's not really practical, because one's judgment about the issues and one's judgment about which arguments are good, they're all bound up together. One specific thing I'll just pick up on was the kind of Van Inwagen idea that philosophers don't know any philosophical truths. And I think the problem is that it's difficult to draw a line between philosophical truths and non-philosophical truths, because to take the example I was using before, if you take the claim that many people know which country they live in, it doesn't sound like a philosophical truth. It just sounds like a piece of very, very ordinary common sense. But in fact, it's philosophically controversial because it's inconsistent with various skeptical doctrines. And in Van Inwagen's case, there's, of course, he does all sorts of complicated footwork, but basically, his metaphysical view it entails that in the natural understanding of the phrase that there are no mountains in China. Van Inwagen's own metaphysical views entail that there are no mountains in China. And so, just by knowing that there are mountains in China, you know something inconsistent with Van Inwagen's metaphysics. Of course, he's got complicated things to say about how natural language works and so on. But examples like that suggest that if a philosophical truth is just any truth that is significant in philosophically in some way, then to say that no philosophers know any philosophical truths basically leads you into general kind of skepticism, because the kinds of ordinary knowledge that any normal human being has are philosophical truths in the sense that they are philosophically significant. They're saying something about the world which some philosophers deny, and so despite all the disagreement, I think that philosophers do know plenty of philosophical truths, and that what this shows is that, which is something does show the limitations of disputation as a philosophical method, is that you can know something but without being able to defeat opponents of it in an argument. In fact, of course, I take it that many ordinary people know huge amounts, but nevertheless, if they had to argue with a philosopher about them, they would probably be out-argued and defeated. So so that the test of whether somebody knows something is not just decided by whether they will triumph in argument. But nevertheless, in the long run, argument is a way of extending and testing our knowledge. So those are very summary kind of responses to the questions that you raised. And again, there's lots more to be said, but I think that's all we have time for at the moment. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Williamson, Dr. 展译文, Professor Hu Xinmin. Let's meet here next Monday night. Looking for Professor Williamson's third lecture, Philosophy and Disagreement. Is this?
Yes, philosophy and clarification.
Yeah. Okay, that's all. Yeah.
Okay, I look forward to seeing you on Monday. All right.
Yeah. Okay. Have a nice weekend.
And you, all of you.